Okay, so we had a little bit of a malfunction earlier. I thought I was filming, but I actually wasn't, so I was basically talking to myself. So I'm going to re-explain these for you. When we talk about the midpoint is exactly in the middle. When we say between, we're talking about somewhere in between. So if I said between, if I look up here, if I say between, that means that I could have 2 points like this, and I could have a third point here. Let's say this is A, B, and C. B is between A and C, but it's not in the middle. B is between A and C, but it's not in the middle. So it's the same thing with San Marcos is technically in between Austin and San Antonio, if you wanted to make a straight line out of it, but it's not exactly in the middle because it's not the same distance from San Marcos to Austin as it is from San Marcos to San Antonio. So we're looking at the difference between and middle. For midpoint, it actually means it's right in the middle. So for the first one here, you have -2 and 6. And there's two ways you can find the midpoint on the number line. This is one-dimensional midpoint. The first one is I can count. I can plot the -2 and the 6, just like I did for number 28, the 4 and the 12. And I can count how far apart they are. So from -2 to 6 is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 units. Well, if I'm looking to go exactly in the middle, that means I would cut that 8 in half. So I'm looking to go 4 units from 6 or 4 units from -2. And again, these are segments. You cannot find the midpoint of a line. A line is infinite. You can't measure a line. You can't find the midpoint of a line. You can't find the midpoint of a ray. A ray is infinite. You can't measure a ray. But we can find the midpoint of a segment because it actually has 2 distinct ending points. So the midpoint would be 2 because 4 from 6 is 2 and 4 from -2 is 2. If you look at this example, and it's not always going to be 8, it just happens to be on this assignment it is, you do the same thing. The distance apart happens to be 8 again. So you count 4 from each end because 8 divided by 2 is 4. That tells you how far away from the end point you are. And we get 8. The other way to do it is the midpoint is actually an average. If you have 100 on a test and a 90 on another test, your midpoint is 95 because that's your average. You had 100 plus 90 divided by 2, and that puts you at 95. That's how you do a midpoint. So here I do -2 plus 6 divided by 2, and that gives me the average, which is 2. That's the same thing I got by counting. Here, I do 4 plus 12 divided by 2. That's the average of 4 and 12, and I get 8, which is the correct midpoint. So that's how we do one-dimensional midpoint. Now when we're looking at two-dimensional midpoint, we can do it multiple ways. Now what I did for the first one, remember midpoint means middle. That means it's equidistant from each endpoint. It's the same distance from each endpoint of the segment. So I plotted these 2 points, and what I did was I wrote 1 point up here, 0, 0, and the other one is 2, 5. I figured out how far it was left and right, that's your x distance, from endpoint to endpoint, and that was 2 units. Just like we figured out that up here, it was 8 units. Then what did we do? I don't want it to be the full distance, I want it to be half the distance. So instead of +2, to get to the middle, I would only move +1, so that's how I got the 1. For the y values, for the vertical movement up and down, we went from 0 to 5, that's 5 units. But again, I don't want the whole distance, I want half of it. So half of 5 is 2.5, so from 0 plus 2.5 gives you 2.5. So that's how we got the answer. Then I used the averages. I did the average of the x's, 0 plus 2 divided by 2, and I got 1, same answer. Then I did 0 plus 5 divided by 2, and I got 2.5. Same answer. So let's look at number 30. We're actually now going to look at the midpoint formula. So here is your midpoint formula. And I've got these circled because you've got to remember the midpoint is addition. The distance formula is difference or subtraction. The midpoint is addition. So what we did is we looked at the x-coordinates. So the midpoint formula is basically the average of the x's and the average of the y's. Remember, this is a comma. don't make it a phantom addition or subtraction sign. Don't get too creative. It's a comma because this is a set of coordinates. You also must have your parentheses in the answer because if you don't have the parentheses, it becomes a list of numbers instead of an actual XY coordinate. So I took the two x's, which were -3 and -8, and I added them together, divided by 2, and I got -5.5. Then I took the two y coordinates and I added them together, 3 plus -5 divided by 2, and I got -1. So that's how I got my midpoint, the average of the two x's and the average of the two y's. So now let's look at 31. 31's a little bit different because you're given an endpoint and the midpoint and told to find the other endpoint. So if I were to draw this out, I've got A, and then here it says B is the midpoint. Everybody see that? B is the midpoint of AC. So I've got this segment AC, and I've got B sitting right in the middle because they tell me it's the midpoint. A is at -5, 1. B is at -2, 0. So where is C? And here's the way you do this one. Let's set up our 3 points. You set them up in a column. You got -1 or -5 and 1 is A, right? Your midpoint, B, is -2, 0. We are looking for C, which is the other one, the other endpoint of the segment. So this is how you do it. I know that B, and we'll label these A and C, I know that B's right in the middle. Well, how did I get from A to B with X coordinates? I went from -5 to -2. That's +3. So that means to get to the next endpoint, it has to be the same distance away because B's in the middle, right? So if B is 3 away from here, it's got to be 3 away from the other point. So I do -2 plus 3, and that puts me at C is 1. That's my X coordinate. Now I'm going to do my Y coordinate. How did I get from 1 to 0? I subtracted 1. So how do I get from the midpoint to the other side? I do the same thing. I subtract 1. So 0 minus 1 is -1. So that is your endpoint. It's at 1, -1. The other way you can do this is to use your midpoint formula here. I know that x1 plus x2 divided by 2 is going to give me my x coordinate of my midpoint, right? What is the x coordinate they already give me for my midpoint? -2, right? And what are my two x's? -5 and 1. So I can do -5 plus 1 divided by 2, I'm just plugging in, should equal -2. I solve this. You can either put this over 1 and cross multiply, or you can multiply the whole equation by 2 to get rid of the denominator. And that leaves me with -5 plus 1 on this side when I multiply. And it leaves me with -4 on this side. So then I would, so then I have -5 plus 1 equals 4. -5 plus 1 does equal 4, so that proves that you got the correct answer with -2 using those coordinates. So that's just another way that you can prove the answer, and you can actually check it and make sure. This is the easiest when you have it set up simply like this. Okay, so let's do 32, and we're going to do 32 the same way. 32, you've got B and C now. So you draw your picture. I've got segment AC, it's the same thing. B is your midpoint. Now I know that B is 3, 7, and I know C is 5, 10. And I want to find A. Okay? So you can set these up either way. I'm going to use the one, I'm going to put C on top, or I mean C on the bottom, because everybody likes to think left to right. It doesn't really matter what order you put them in. But let's look at it this way. I've got A, and I don't know A. I'm looking for A. I've got B, which is the midpoint, is at 3, 7. And I've got C, which is at 5, 10. So I know B is smack dab in the middle. So I've got to find out what A is. Well, now we just go this way. How did I get from my y coordinate to my y coordinate, from my endpoint to my midpoint? 10 to 7, I subtracted 3. So to get to the other one, I subtract 3 again. So 7 minus 3 is 4. Then I'm going to do the other side. How did I get from 5 to 3? I subtracted 2. Since B's in the middle, you got to do the same thing. 3 minus 2 gives you 1. So your midpoint is 1, 4. Or sorry, your end point is 1, 4. And remember, this is an end point. As is this. This is an end point. I may have accidentally called it a midpoint. I don't remember. But those are end points. These are when you're given the midpoint and you have to find the end point.